So a very warm official welcome to our Heart of Discipline um, conversation tonight. For those who are on the recording, delighted to be here with Adrian Wood. We're going to facilitate this tonight for you. What we're going to do, the plan of the night, is that we are going to start off with looking at, it's going to start a little bit of a preamble before we watch Dr. Newfeld's recording. We're going to be watching a recorded from his amazing course, Making Sense of Discipline. It's a four-session course, and we're just going to take about a 23-minute snippet out of it. So if you want more, feel free. That is something we'll talk about later that you can jump on and do on the Newfeld Institute campus self-paced course. So tonight, what we're going to do when we're looking at it is we're going to do a bit of zooming out, because obviously we're not going to tackle everything there is about discipline in this 1 hour conversation, because it's a huge topic, and it's one also that there are so many opinions about, and so many just strong topics and strong ideas around. And sometimes I think as parents it can be like, no matter what you do as a parent, somebody's going to be judging you or thinking that you're not doing it right. And we are very based in a behavioural approach, discipline, where we're very much looking at what's on the screen here, about teaching a lesson by controlling the outcomes of a child's behaviour. And that is so much what we're about. And some of the messages that we have are, you've got to get in there right away, and don't you let that child get away with that. You've got to send them to the room. You've got to do timeout. You've got to actually nip it in the bud. You cannot let that child speak to you like that. You cannot let that behaviour happen. You've got to do something to stop it. And, and I remember people saying to me, well, if you take something off them, they say, well, actually, I don't care, then you just need to hunt around a little bit harder, find something that they really do care about so that it's going to make an impact. So we're absorbed in all of that, immersed in all of that, and that's a lot of our messages. What we're going to look at tonight is just actually what is at the heart of discipline, and what actually is needed for discipline to take effect. And so while in a lot of other parenting courses we might be zooming in, look at specific behaviours and how we'd work with it and what we'd do, what are some strategies that we might use to stop a child hitting, or to stop a child swearing, or to stop a child doing whatever they're doing. What we're going to do tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different, and we're actually going to zoom out. We're going to zoom out, look at what else is around and what is needed for discipline. So while we have the teaching lesson here going on,
not appropriate.
Part of the puzzle there.
What are you watching?
Actually, there's some more puzzle pieces here as well. Now, zooming out, we're going to look at, and some other things that are really important that we focus on. One of the things here is attachment. And if you've done any of the Newfeld courses or material before, you'll be aware of how much attachment is our brain's top priority. It's our most eminent need. And so that connection, that closeness, that togetherness is for sure, it's our drive, which means that not having that is going to be our biggest threat. And so we're going to, obviously that is another important piece to look at when we're looking at discipline. Another one is emotion, and looking at how we have strong emotions and instincts underneath the behaviour, and actually most problematic behaviour actually comes from big emotions. And so that's another piece when we're zooming out, we can see maturation. Just the child's maturation, what level are they developmentally? Because that makes such a difference for what is going to work and how we can work with in a disciplined way. Of course, another piece to take into consideration is how our brain actually works. And we're really fortunate now with so much more science and neuroscience can actually help us to understand now how our brain is working, and so what's needed. So I want you just to think before we watch the video, I want you just to think about that and thinking about, when we have um, when we look at behavior and we're just focused on the behavior, and we have to do something about it, we have to nip it in the bud right now, we have to consequence it, without actually noticing what is underneath, what's driving it, we can actually miss so much of the key things. I think also often, I work with a lot of parents who come to me and say, well, I'm doing all these things, I'm doing so much, yet nothing seems to be working, nothing seems to be changing. Or, there's just something that doesn't feel right even. I'm doing all these things that everybody's telling me to. All the professionals are telling me that I need to do this and I need to do that. Yet I'm doing it because that's what I'm told, but it just does not feel right to me on an intuitive level. So we're going to look a bit at that tonight as well. So I'm going to just stop the share of this now, and we're going to get into Dr. Gordon Newfield's presentation. I don't want to talk too much more because this is quite a stark presentation, and I want you to be able to enjoy it. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit more, unpack it a bit more. As I said, there'll be a lot in this and a lot of extra bits that we probably won't be able to cover tonight. Let's hopefully we can actually get closer to that heart of discipline. Enjoy. Whoops, a daisy. What am I doing here? Sorry.
Well, I'm going to start with an image of the brain. We're going to map it out very, very simply here. And the first map of the brain comes from the blank slate theory of the brain. So we had instinct and emotion here, but it was considered unimportant. John Locke, who popularized this way of thinking, he didn't invent it, but he certainly popularized it, a physician of 17th century, a good writer, and therefore his writing stayed. He didn't have much use for instinct and emotion, for anything he considered irrational for that matter. He considered these elements less than human, or at least the man part of being human. He had a problem with women and children as he considered them too emotional. He scoffed at emotion as being inferior to reason. And so that is the underlying foundation of this. His solution to being irrational was to treat all behavior as instrumental, as having a purpose to have an effect some way, acting upon the world, basically ignoring instinct and emotion. I think he thought if he ignored it, maybe it would go away. And so what he did is he proposed that if we could alter the outcomes to behavior, all behavior was instrumental. Now, this is still the foundation of learning theory today. Believe it or not, 400 years later, after all the evidence to the contrary, it's still the dominant paradigm. And so what he thought is and I was trained in this particular as a graduate student. I was trained in learning theory as well because it was the dominant theory of the time. But if we could alter the outcomes of a child's behavior, in altering the outcomes, it would shape the behavior, and in shaping the behavior, we would be informing the mind. The blank slate, or tabula rasa in Latin, the idea is the mind was a blank slate, and we write on this mind our values, our desires for the child, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. That's not appropriate. That's what I like. We would write our values upon their mind by altering the outcomes of their behavior. And so that was the basic idea, and it has stuck. It has been the most influential idea influencing the field, I think, than any other thing. It's still serving as a foundational assumption for most discipline practices today. I wish I could be that influential. Oh my goodness. This idea took root. So behavior is a function of its outcome. The formal hypothesis, behavior is a function of its outcome. All behavior is instrumental, and the foundation, as I said. Now, John Locke was considered enlightened at the time, and certainly it is a vast improvement over the prevailing belief that existed at that time that behavior was predetermined, in fact, part of a preformed personality. It was called preformation theory, and so the behavior was rather fixed. They thought of children as miniature adults. In fact, the art at that time depicted children as miniature adults. Some called it the homunculus theory of personality. It simply unfolded, but it was fixed. Now, we tend to associate this idea with the Dark Ages, but upon closer examination, it is still the major flaw in our thinking, and even in John Locke's thinking in the 17th century. The irony is that he hadn't really escaped preformationist thinking after all. He assumed that all children were like adults, in that their brains functioned like adult brains are supposed to function. Now, we know that is not true. Piaget, the greatest developmentalist of all time, let us know that children were not like adults, although he predated brain science, but brain science has brought that to us, that, oh my goodness, there's a whole development here. And the first phase of brain development, when the hemispheres are separated, the eyes are separated in their vision, is unlike the second phase of development when everything gets connected. The hemispheres bridge between them, when feelings mix, when we see through both eyes instead of just one eye, and so on. And so there is a whole development that has order to it. Now, some of the ways that today's consequence-based discipline theory is rooted in the preformation theory of the Dark Ages, some of the ways is that their behavior is assumed to be on purpose. How many times have you heard that? And so we assume it's on purpose. Adler built his whole theory on that. And the current architects of today's behavioral approaches built their approach on that. So discipline is about thwarting that purpose, not letting a child get away with something. Now, from another area of psychology, we have discovered something called the fundamental perception error. Basically, the less we can make sense of someone, the more we project that what they do, they're doing on purpose. That's what's behind conspiracy theories, for instance. And so it turns out that what was happening is because John Locke couldn't make sense of the brain, we can't make sense of the brain. We assume it's on purpose. Now, the fact is that most behavior is not instrumental, but coming from instinct and emotion. Now, it's true that instinct and emotion, we've now discovered, have purpose. Every single emotion has a purpose, but it is not the child's purpose. Secondly, their mind should be in control. So discipline is about informing their minds through teaching them a lesson. Now, the mind should be in control. This is true ultimately, but this takes years of healthy development to get there. And before this, it should not be in control. The default mode for the immature is that the heart is in control. Why? Because the brain already has pre-programmed, wired-in responses. It is what emotional intelligence is at its root. There's intelligence in emotion. There's intelligence in instinct. And we ought not to ignore that fact. We ought to work with it. Thirdly, the idea is that reason should rule, so discipline is about appealing to reason. So, yes, this is our ultimate objective. Reason should rule, but we can't get there through using logical consequences, as was the idea of Rudolf Dreikurs, another one of the architects of today's discipline approaches, or acting as if the brain isn't already pre-wired to allow instincts and emotions to rule, and functions that way for some time, even many adults. Fourthly, that children's brain operate in the work motif, just like adults do. Now, as adults, our brains are preoccupied with consequences. If I do this, what will I lead to? If I do that, at least it should be preoccupied. It is called the work motif, outcome-based, and it is part of the achievement drive that we go to the outcomes that we're wanting. But this is the biggest mistake in children, because we've discovered that their brains are not in the work motif. In fact, there will be a watershed experience that we'll talk about when they get there shortly. And so they don't even consider the outcomes. If you say to a 3-year-old, oh, if you don't brush your teeth, your teeth will get cavities and we'll have to go to the dentist. Mommy, why do you say that? You're so mean. They didn't get it. Then you're thinking, okay, I'll try and explain it. If you drop that ice cream cone, I'm not going to give you another one. Oh, Mommy! No. Their brain doesn't work in outcomes. Now, this is the most important thing to understand. And in the last session, we're going to look at the play mode, which is the opposite of the work mode, and how important it is to bring that into our discipline modus operandi. And so, no. The ability to consider outcomes, even many adults do have that, and many of the adolescents that I worked with severe behavior problems had no ability to think in outcomes. And so assuming that it exists before it actually does can actually harm its development. And so there was the idea that, well, even if they're not like adults, surely treating children as if they were like adults will make it come true. No. It will not make it come true. And if we do not make sense, and the motto of the Neufeld Institute is to make sense of kids, and this is why this is the very heart of the material. If we cannot make sense of kids, our attempts to manage their behavior will be out of order. We will not get it. So we're not out of the dark ages yet with regards to managing a child's behavior. We've been stuck in some conceptual ruts. So how does the child's brain actually work? Well, there was another theory that existed long before 17th century England, and we have come back to it as the correct theory, and at that time it was referred to as the inner springs theory. And in the inner springs theory, there's the thinking brain, of course, but instinct and emotion are at the heart. This idea had actually been put forward by the ancient Greeks, but it ran into trouble because, of course, it could not be verified by actual studies of the brain. And so there was the idea that we could only study what we can see. Since we can only see behavior, then we treat behavior as not coming from anywhere. Well, just because we couldn't see it didn't mean it didn't have inner springs. And this is still the problem. However, now we can peek inside of the brain so that we can actually see, oh my goodness, are there all kinds of wired up movements, all kinds of pre-programmed movements to act. And so, in other words, instinct and emotion are at the heart of the problem. I'll put the heart here because when we think of the heart as separate than the mind, draw the heart. And so when I refer to heart, I will be referring to the place from which our impulses to act come from instinct and emotion. And the more books come out on this, the more we discover, or the more has been discovered about the instincts and emotions that are nature's way of taking care of us. They move the child under certain circumstances. In fact, the information, as we're going to look at, when we sense our world It doesn't even go right to the mind. It goes first of all to the emotion to see if there are any pre-programmed, wired-in responses that would be relevant for the first part. So part of our problem is that that our society is not evolved in synchrony with how brains are designed. The other part of the problem is we're not honoring the child's heart, not trying to discern what nature is trying to do, not thanking it for its efforts. And so we end up working against it rather than with it. Actually, we do better with our pets these days, especially our dogs. We have finally figured out not to tell our dogs to stop barking. Why? Because their instinct is to bark when there's threat. And so the dog whisperers tell us, thank the dog, and they'll stop. Oh my goodness, it works like magic. You thank the dog for barking and job is done. It's much more likely to take care of the problem than telling the dog not to bark when their instinct is to bark. To repeat here, behavior itself is the outcome. That is, behavior is the outcome of instinct and emotion. Now, when we add consequences to these, so this is what we must make sense of. What is happening here? Where is the behavior coming from? What are the inner springs of it? Now, when we add outcome to this equation, when we add to it outcome to it, what are we doing? When this is wired up this way, and it is primarily wired up this way for the child, what are we doing when we add outcome to it? Well, we are informing their heart, not their mind. We are informing their heart. Now, since emotion happens to them, behavior likewise happens to them. Now, only a small portion of behavior is actually instrumental. And that instrumental behavior is not the behavior that tends to get a child into trouble. So when we alter the child's circumstances, as we are told to do by almost all experts, we are not informing the mind again, but informing the heart, and that is the irony with discipline, is that we are simply pushing a child's emotional buttons for better or for worse. Now, let me provide you with some common examples of when we fail to take inner springs into action or into consideration. When we fail to take them, we actually can make matters worse. Now, I'll give you 3 examples. They're fairly common examples. We'll start with lying. Now, if we view lying as instrumental behavior, and we almost always do, you see, because this is the way we have got stuck in this conceptual thinking. If somebody lies, they lie on purpose. We see it as a child being manipulative, spinning a story to stay out of trouble, trying to pull the wool over our eyes, trying to get their own way. So, thinking of it as instrumental, we know what the deal is. For 400 years we've known what the deal is. If we don't like it when our children lie, then our first thoughts are to teach the child a lesson that lying is a bad thing. So maybe what we'll do is give the child a warning, raise our voice, add a consequence, let them know the consequences of lying. Nobody will believe them. Tell them the story of crying wolf, whatever we do. But where does lying come from in a young child? Wow. It is wired up. Well, first of all, going back to what we're trying to do here is to inform the mind by teaching a lesson. That's how we're going to respond. That is how we have been taught. That is the whole concept of discipline, to inform the mind by teaching a lesson. But where does lying come from? What is the inner spring of lying? Well, for the most part, especially in young children, lying springs from being alarmed. And they are wired to be alarmed when sensing a threat to togetherness in some house. So when the child can sense, oh, that look in mother's eyes, that tone of voice in dad's eyes, I'm running into trouble here, I'm running into trouble. So alarm is there, and alarm blindly. Now, there is no sight to emotion. One thing about emotion is it is blind, and it blindly moves them to caution. Their brains pick up that trouble lies in one direction. So then a story, to the extent that they are capable of, immediately is constructed to avoid that trouble. No, I didn't. No, I didn't. It just happens to them. In other words, the lying springs from alarm, not thinking. And you can tell by their fabrications, which are laughable at times, their stories that hold any water at all, that the mind is not involved. Yet we persist in trying to form their mind. This is pure, blind, emotional behavior. They are not as dumb as their story would indicate. They are emotionally driven by alarm. And what were our responses? What would our responses have done to them? Warning the child to stay out of trouble, confronting them, giving a consequence, communicating our disapproval, raising our voice. These are all alarming a child further. So if they're alarming a child further, now you should be able to do this equation, right? What are we doing? Informing their mind, or are we pushing their emotional buttons? Are we provoking them, alarming them further? You get it. Doesn't make sense, does it? Once you see this equation, it doesn't make sense. Because you see, the heart is already, we start off with being born with the heart in charge, with pre-programmed instincts to be moved when. And so we need to understand this with children. Some never graduate from that place. They spend their whole life in it. But when we know that's what it is, we can work with it rather than against it. We can work around it rather than against it. There are all kinds of ways we can do, and this is the key again to the child whisperer in this way. Even if it's only intuitive, they're working with the heart, not the mind. When you work with the heart, you'll win the day. Now, another example. Let's say we have attacking behavior, an eruption of attacking behavior. Let's say a child erupts into a tantrum, foul language, hits a sibling, or expresses hostility in some way, uses foul language, etc. Now, of course, this goes against our values of nonviolence, and so we will try to impress upon the child the error of their way, that aggression doesn't pay, that it's not acceptable, that is against the rules. And so how do we do this? Well, with our mind, discipline is about altering outcomes because all behavior is instrumental to get their own way again, and so we alter the outcomes to teach the child a lesson and get something through their thick head. So we may attempt to do this by giving a timeout, by imposing a sanction, by taking something away from them, by warning them, again, all of these kinds of things. But where did the eruption of attacking energy come from? Well, again, this how we attempt to inform their mind. Where did this come from? Well, we have discovered that all eruptions of attack, all aggression, including self-attack, non-directed attack, are rooted in the emotion of frustration. Well, what's frustration? Well, we'll look more at that. It's a powerful primal emotion that is triggered when something doesn't work. It is huge. We share it with all the mammals. It is a huge emotion. Now, what would have been the effects of the lessons we were trying to teach? What would have been the effect of imposing a sanction, of taking away of consequence? What would have been that effect? Did the consequences we impose decrease a child's frustration or increase it? Now, you know the answer, right? Oh my goodness. We actually are the what we tried to do would have frustrated the child even more. So, oh my goodness, were we pouring gasoline on our fire? Well, that explains our lack of efficacy, doesn't it? Is it children who have been the most disciplined or have the most aggression problems? Yes, how do we explain that? Exactly like this. You see, because we weren't thinking inner springs. We weren't asking the question, where does it come from? What are the antecedents of what I see? Instead, we say, what should I do? What should the consequences be? This is about teaching the child a lesson, and what we do inadvertently is make matters worse.
All right, we're still recording, so we'll just keep your videos off at this stage, but we'd love you to be able to pop in the chat any thoughts there. I just want to apologize too. I just looked at the time once we got started and I was going, oh my goodness, where's that gone? So we would love to be able to have a bit of a discussion with you though, if you've got some questions around that, but we also understand if some of you have to go, then we certainly understand that, and there will be the recording to watch. But if you're happy to stay for a few minutes longer as we can unpack that, would be wonderful. So feel free to put any comments in the chat there of what stood out to you. That would be great.
Isn't it great being reminded, Sandy, of some of those key ideas around discipline? What are we really achieving by it? Are we making things better or worse emotionally for our child?
Absolutely. Just even being able to look underneath behaviour to what's actually driving it is so important. Yeah. Where's that behaviour coming from?
But
Yeah.
Kelly's got a question here. Great to ask the question, where is this behaviour coming from? More of a comment. It's all very familiar, the standard approach. It is familiar, and it just feels like the right way because we've all been told this is the right way to do it, that I must put a consequence in or I'm not training my child the right way.
Yeah. When we zoom out though, we see so much more, hey? I think one of the things I love about this approach is that once we see that, you know, by just working in that moment and all the things that we're told to do, once we can take the pressure off ourselves to do that, and we see what's actually needed for what's driving that behaviour and what's needed for our child to be able to manage life, offers an alternative way of working, I think, as well. It means we can actually be more playful in some of those situations. Yeah.
We've got a question here. We start out life with the heart in charge, emotional behavior, yes. What is the alternative response to the two examples?
The two examples, was it the two examples that he was using around the frustration and the alarm, I'm wondering?
Yeah.
And that's where we get tricky into big answers. But I think is the yes there. I think it's also looking at what's driving it and how we can take some of the, once we see that it's emotionally driven, we have to work with that emotion. And that's where some of that can go into play. Okay, there's something not working here for the child. Take frustration, for example. There's something not working. But then it asks us a question, I wonder what it is that's not working for this child. Can we alter something there? Or what other ways can we actually give some outlet for this big frustration so that it's not getting in the way and coming out in ways that's getting this child in trouble? And that's going to look different in a whole lot of situations.
One thing that I really like to have as a maxim, when there's a big explosion, say I've got one child in my family who's really like, that was my cookie, you took my cookie from me, it's not, and there's a big outburst of emotion, and then they hit their brother for taking the cookie. Obviously, brother needs to be taken care of and comforted and kept safe, and the hitter needs to have a little chat too. But first of all, I always say, come alongside the emotion in the child. It felt really unfair, didn't it? That really hurt your feelings, didn't it? And we let their brother know, I'm going to come to you shortly. I'm really sorry you got hit, but we've got to diffuse the emotion and come alongside, settle it down before we can have the conversation that says, that's not the best way through here. How could we think of other ways? So coming alongside is a good one to keep in mind.
Keeping the relationship strong, right? It's not letting any behavior break the connection. And that can be really, really, really hard to do. But that's one of the key things, thinking of connection. And as Adrian's saying, like, how can we come alongside that emotion? One of the other things that people often say to me, especially when they're hearing some of this approach, and like I said, yeah, we can't unpack it all tonight, but they often say that, oh, it just means that they get away with it and you don't actually do anything. You don't have any consequence or anything. But there is also place for that. And especially like in schools and with siblings, there's still, it's not like nothing's being done, because we still need something in there for social justice. I think there's a difference of having those things in there, social justice, and having those things in there thinking that's going to change the behaviour of the child. Well, we need to hold on to the emotions and be able to help them to still feel them through.
And I can see a question coming through here saying, it's important we don't go the other way and take off all limits and all consequences and boundaries. How do we dance with the relationship as the heart is so key? And I think, Sandy, you've started to address that. And Dr. Neufeld does say himself, look, we do need to put consequences in for social justice reasons, particularly, say, in a school context, a child is just throwing a chair at the teacher. We don't just say, now let me come and have a little gentle chat. And, everyone else in the class goes, well, that wasn't fair what they did, so it needs to be, I'm going to come and see you outside. You need to go and wait for me outside. I'll come and talk to you shortly. And everybody in the class knows, oh, we're in trouble now. And it doesn't matter if that talk is actually quite gentle. No one needs to know. But there is a follow-up. There is a consequence. And as long as we understand, the consequence isn't really solving the emotional issues that triggered the behavior in the child. The consequence is for social justice reasons, but it's not doing anything to actually help the child move forward emotionally, and that's the work we really need to get to.
Yeah, and Fee's following on with that, saying using tone of voice seems quite key to co-regulate the child, which can be difficult for parents to do if they themselves are activated by the child's behaviour. I think when we're going to social justice rather than changing the behaviour specifically, we can actually come alongside the child in a nicer way. We don't have to have that stern face and the angry voice and things like that. But of course, that can be triggered in us or evoked in us as well in those situations. So, yeah, that's another very important piece. But we can actually come alongside differently. And as I was saying before, play is our friend here. Play can actually help in those situations, not just when there's big feelings, but actually backing it up. Those situations where we might want to get a child to do something that they're not going to want to do, and knowing, oh, we're going to have that battle again because I'm going to want them to unload the dishwasher and they're going to say no, and then things are going to escalate. Well, actually, how can we put it into play? How can we hide our agenda in play? And right at that point, so things don't actually feel like they're going head to head, we can actually that up as well. And how can we put some of that built up frustration, how can we find the play outlets for that as well, so that it has some other place to go?
I'm always one for practical examples. Do you have an idea of, say it is the dishes that the child won't do, how can that become playful? How can we
So again, it's going to depend on the child, the parent, and it's going to depend on the age of the children, right? And what your child will go for. And it can just be as simple as a game, making it into, it might be singing instructions. That's something that we've done a lot in our house when our kids were younger, or even now, actually. It's just actually singing instructions instead of saying them. You might just sing a beautiful song. It doesn't actually have to be that beautiful. Just sing it. Oh, now it's your turn to do the dishes or whatever you do. And just which actually lands in a better way for your child as well. They don't hear the tone of your busyness or whatever, but it lands for them. a playful way. They might sing it back, they might sing something back to you, but you can just do that and just keep it going like that. You'll find ways, thinking about what's playful for your child. It might be for younger children, it might be a race to see who can get there first. It might be
Mm.
some of those things, or you can actually just have some other playfulness. You're doing a game and you might just do a follow the leader or something and just end up there and doing it with them. There's so many things once you start thinking about how can I make this playful, knowing your child, that you can put it in there.
Mm.
Laura's saying sometimes coming alongside a child can trigger them further. It's such a delicate attunement, a learning curve for parents. Absolutely. Timing is everything. So you're not going to, when the child is already very heightened and exploding, it's not the time necessarily come along and say, oh, you're so frustrated. It's a delicate dance, absolutely, Laura, as to when you can get in there and when you can't. It might be just waiting until that's gone and then coming alongside. It might be when it's smaller, you can get in there. I heard someone saying, standing in front of a child who's erupting and telling them to calm down is no more helpful than standing in front of a volcano that's erupting and telling it to stop. So once they get to that point, it's a matter of just, okay, how can we keep everybody safe here? How can we keep the relationship strong, or as strong as we can, get through this, and then we can do some work afterwards. So yeah, absolutely.
Mm. Just got someone here saying, I like the come alongside approach. One tool I use is the concept of a do-over, which gives the child the opportunity to repeat the scenario with a better mindset. If I added coming alongside to this, it might be even better. And I like the do-over idea because once the heat of the emotion has died down and the stress of the situation is over, we've re-established connection. It might be a few hours later in the day. It might be bedtime as we're reflecting on the day. That's a nice time to say, remember when this happened? And they might hang their head in shame because they hit their brother and they didn't mean to. But what would you do if you could do it again? How do you think you'd like for it to have gone? And just imagining in the mind and playing out all the other scenarios, it's a chance to really connect with your child emotionally, to reflect on the incident, but once all of the heat of the moment has passed.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there is a thing in there too about as parents being able to be aware of what's happening inside as well, because big emotions aren't just for children, as we all know. And, and I think our children evoke big emotions in us as well. And so, we need to be really careful that we might need to take a break back. We might need to take time to, make an excuse to leave them for a wee moment so we can actually get our own mix back, and so that we can come back in and be able to work with the child, be able to see what's happening for them rather than just working out of our own frustration in the moment as well, which is so hard. It's so easy to say that, but it's really, really hard to be able to do that. Yeah. Emotion is powerful. Absolutely. But I think, as I said, tonight was just a bit of a start on the conversation because it is huge. And just being able to look at what is at the heart, the heart of discipline. What is at the heart of what we're looking for when we've got those big behaviors that are coming out and getting children getting in trouble with them? What's at the heart of it? And if we just stay focused on what we're seeing, we're actually just going to be battling against that behavior, and we're probably not going to make any headway. And certainly not make headway and keep the relationship strong and keep their development. You're not in the way of their development and their maturation. And so even just to be able to zoom back out as we're thinking about this, managing behaviors and discipline, to zoom back out and look at some of these other elements, I think helps us to get more to the heart, and then let that guide us as to what we're going to do in the situation, and where we can add play in there as well. So as I said before, if you're interested in this, I might later on facilitate Making Sense of Discipline course if you're interested, but certainly it is on the campus, on the Newfield campus website, and you can do it self-paced, which means you can do it in our time zone, the time zone that works for you. And it's an amazing course. Also, of course, we have our conference coming up too, which we'll talk about a bit more. Yeah. You got any other comments there, Adrian?
Yeah, no, it's just such an important topic, discipline. I feel like every outburst is an opportunity to respond in a caring way, even though it might not be our natural instinct to think about the child's emotions and supporting them through that. So I know that every time we think, oh no, I've had all of this terrible behavior today, I must be a terrible parent, you might want to reframe it and think, every bit of difficult behavior is an opportunity for me to come back with coming alongside energy and helping my child find their way through their emotions and making room for them.
Yeah, yeah. Finding those places, there's other places that can take care of those big emotions as well, hey? When we see that emotion that just needs an outlet. Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, yeah. We might just turn the recording off there, and thank you for those on the recording.